A Senate draft of market structure legislation came out last week, and it's looking a little different than what the House offered, mostly because there's just less there. Eventually, these two versions need to become one. Folks are kind of wondering what happens. Rebecca, I see you kind of
Yeah,
shaking your shoulders
I
there.
want to. We should step back and actually talk about process, right? Because
Yeah,
clarity
let's
passed out of the House with a huge bipartisan supermajority, and it goes to the Senate, and you think, oh, okay, well now the Senate should just look at it, maybe make some amendments and pass it. But there is a very different process going on right now, and what we saw come out of the Senate last week was only the Senate banking draft. So it really only looks at what's happening on the SEC or the securities side. Interestingly, just to bring it full circle, there's also a big part about illicit finance at the back, because Renato, sort of to your point, the Senate very much cares about illicit finance. Not that the House did not, but that has really been a focus of a lot of senators, and a lot of drafts on illicit finance bills came out of the Senate over the last few years prior to this. There's a whole separate process going on in Senate Ag, which oversees the CFTC, where they're also doing their own draft, which will cover the CFTC. Then they will have to figure out sort of how to harmonize them after they come out of both the separate committees. So we haven't even seen sort of the full set of market structure legislation that's coming out of the Senate yet.
So what I'm hearing is that maybe people are saying it's more confusing than it is. This is just a process. We're just going through the process.
I do think it's probably how legislation works is probably confusing. Like, we all probably should do some crypto, like
a 101.
Yeah. And sort of, I'm just a bill kind of song for all of us. Maybe we can draft it and do it on, a week from now or something like that. But I think what's also confusing, or has brought a lack of clarity around this. Did I do it? But is that I don't even think this is the final draft from Senate Banking, because they also put out an RFI to ask for feedback from industry on a whole host of topics. So DeFi is not covered in this. Bankruptcy remoteness is something that they've also asked questions about, tax, things like that. So this is sort of like a skinny draft, and that I think we'll see a much more robust draft after all the feedback is digested from the RFI responses.
One thing that I heard a lot from people in the industry when I was at Consensus was that we needed to just jam through clarity, or something very close to clarity, in both houses of Congress, because if not, if we tried to have different drafts and spend a lot of time debating this, it would not happen before the midterms, and thus would never happen at all. Very prominent.
I heard that too.
Yeah, a very prominent industry figure told me that specifically. Obviously, that's not Senate Banking didn't get that memo, and it doesn't sound like Senate Agriculture will either. What do we think about the prospects of having legislation before the midterms? And if that doesn't occur, are we going to be left with SEC rulemaking like Hester Peirce and her group?
Well, I'll say the same thing was said about the Genius Act, or, about stablecoin legislation, right? The whole thing was, if we don't get stablecoin legislation done, that won't be done. And it did. I think you have to give Congress credit for the fact that there's some complicated issues here, and that they have been working on it. And that work doesn't necessarily track the election cycle. So I do think that, as Rebecca said, DeFi is one area that I think is going to continue to be difficult. And it may be that there's less focus on DeFi and there's more focus on sort of what you think about exchanges and brokers and clearinghouses and trading venues and that sort of thing. But I also looked at what the Senate Banking did with the RFI, and I thought, oh, wow, there's a lot here that could come in. And I think that ultimately we're going to keep looking to what Senate Ag does. One thing that I have continued to be an advocate for, and your program has covered that as you're written, CoinDesk, is that I think that Congress needs to give CFTC a definition of retail customer. CFTC is just not used to dealing with retail customers. And if ultimately the CFTC is going to have jurisdiction over Bitcoin and ETH and spot crypto that's not securities, there's going to be a lot of retail. And so I think ultimately what it'll help do is help shift the mindset of the CFTC, who's used to dealing with institutional players, to be more like thinking about how do we level the playing field for retail customers?
Rebecca, would love to hear your perspective there. Do you think, to Renato's question, that we'll get legislation before midterms?
I will say Chairman Scott, who's chair of the Senate Banking Committee, has said he is committed to getting it done before October. Not sure that's going to line up perfectly with the Senate Ag timeline, because I think their draft won't come out till everyone's back from the August recess. But I am very hopeful that we will not lose momentum. I think, especially for things like centralized actors in this space, we kind of know what to do, right? It is not so far out of the realm. And so I think it's really important. And obviously the president's working group report, it says like, this is something we really need. Actually itself makes recommendations for what we need to see in market structure, as Commissioner Goldsmith Romero said earlier. And I think for companies like Jito Labs that started in the US, have decided to stay in the US, weathered the storm of the last 4 years. And I will say our founders thought about leaving at certain periods of time because of things. It's really important to get market structure legislation done to start giving some certainty to both retail users, but also institutions, so that people can continue building and that the administration can really capitalize on the fact that they've said, welcome home, stay here, be here. And so I think it's critical that we really, as an industry, support market structure legislation getting done.